Ever wonder how some companies just seem to roll with the punches, even when those punches are like major corporate crises?
Yeah, we're talking about those make or break moments, product recalls, PR nightmares, the stuff that gives CEOs sleepless nights.
Exactly. But what's interesting to me is that understanding this stuff, this crisis management, it's not just for the folks in the C-suite.
Right. It's about understanding how the world works, how quickly things can go south, and how to navigate those choppy waters because, let's face it, they're gonna happen.
And today, we're diving deep into that world corporate crisis averted. We'll uncover the strategies, the successes, and yeah, even some of those cringeworthy missteps that companies have made along the way.
Because, sometimes those missteps are the most illuminating, right? You learn more from what not to do sometimes.
Absolutely. And hopefully our listeners can learn a thing or two to apply to their own lives because let's be real, crises don't just happen in the corporate world.
So true. But what's fascinating? Crises, while often viewed as catastrophic, they can actually be opportunities for growth, believe it or not.
That's interesting. How so?
Well, companies that successfully manage crises often emerge stronger, more resilient. They build a deeper connection with their stakeholders. It's kind of like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah, like that old saying. And sometimes it even makes you more innovative, right? Like you have to think outside the box to come up with solutions.
Exactly. You're forced to innovate, to adapt. A classic example of this is the whole Tylenol scare back in the 80s.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was huge. Talk about a PR nightmare. I mean, it could have been the end for Tylenol, right?
It could have been, but instead it became this pivotal moment, not just for Johnson & Johnson, but for the entire industry.
Okay, so how did they do it? How did they turn that around? What did they do that was so different?
Well, they took swift and decisive action. Faced with a situation where their product, their flagship product, was linked to these tragic deaths, they didn't hesitate.
They didn't just pull a few bottles off the shelves, did they?
No, not at all. They issued an immediate recall of millions of bottles of Tylenol nationwide. They put public safety ahead of profits, even though it cost them a fortune.
Wow, that's a bold move, especially in the middle of a crisis like that. I can't even imagine the pressure they were under.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure was immense, but their actions sent a very clear message. We prioritize your safety above all else. And they didn't stop there.
Okay, so what else did they do? Because it seems like there's more to it than just the recall, right?
Right. They were incredibly transparent throughout the whole ordeal. They worked openly with law enforcement, kept the public informed every step of the way, and they actively engaged with the media, answered all the tough questions.
So transparency was key. It's like that old adage, honesty is the best policy, but put into action on a massive scale.
Exactly. And you know what else? They introduced tamper-proof packaging as a direct result of this crisis.
Oh, wow. Right. The tamper-proof seals, we take those for granted now?
I know, right? But that was them. That was Johnson & Johnson's response to this crisis, and it revolutionized the industry.
So they turned a potentially brand-ending crisis into a catalyst for innovation, for industry-wide change.
Exactly. And it highlights just how powerful decisive action coupled with honest and transparent communication can be. It can turn a negative situation into an opportunity to actually strengthen a company's reputation and even drive positive change.
Powerful stuff. It really makes you wonder, though, are there times when companies try to avoid that kind of radical transparency? Maybe when the stakes are even higher.
Unfortunately, yes. And that often leads to even bigger problems, as we saw with the BP oil spill.
Oh, man, talk about a disaster. And not just for the company, but for the environment, for the people living and working in the Gulf. Images of that oil slick were everywhere. And even though BP spent billions on cleanup and compensation, the damage to their reputation, that was immeasurable.
Right, and it's a classic example of how not to handle a crisis, at least in the beginning. Because while BP did eventually attempt to manage the crisis through constant updates, media appearances, public statements, their initial response was just lacking.
Lacking? What do you mean by that?
It was slow and it came across as lacking empathy. Like they didn't quite grasp the magnitude of what had happened.
It's that perception versus reality thing, isn't it? Like what you're doing versus how it's being perceived.
Exactly. And their CEO at the time, he made a few public statements that, well, let's just say they didn't go over well.
Oh, really? Like what?
He talked about wanting to get his life back.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
At a time when so many people were losing their livelihoods, their homes.
Yeah, it was a huge misstep. Talk about tone deaf. And the thing is, Even with the best intentions, sometimes the words you use, they matter just as much as the actions you take.
Absolutely. Words can wound, especially in a crisis situation. So empathy is crucial.
Right. People need to know that you understand the gravity of the situation, that you're genuinely committed to making things right. And with BP, initially it seemed more like damage control than genuine remorse.
So what should companies do? I mean, how do you prepare for something like that, communication-wise?
Well, that's where having a clear communication plan is crucial. And it's not just about what you say, but how you say it, when you say it, who you say it to.
Okay, yeah, let's break that down a bit. What are the essential elements of a solid crisis communication plan?
First and foremost, you need a dedicated crisis team with clearly defined roles. Decision makers, PR experts, legal counsel, subject matter experts, the whole 9 yards. And this team, they need to be ready to go at a moment's notice.
So it's like having a well-rehearsed orchestra, but instead of beautiful music, they're dealing with, well, chaos.
That's a great analogy because it is about being orchestrated. You need to identify potential crises before they happen. What could disrupt your operations? Industry-specific risks, product or service issues, things like that.
So a little bit of what's the worst that could happen, but like in a productive way.
Exactly. And once you've identified those vulnerabilities, you can start crafting communication strategies for each scenario. Key messages, target audiences, clear lines of communication, all of that.
That makes sense. So like having those pre-drafted messages, those communication channels ready to go, that would have been invaluable for BP.
Absolutely, because it allows for faster, more effective communication. And that's critical, especially in those early stages of a crisis. Remember, we live in the age of social media now. News travels at lightning speed.
Yeah, no more burying your head in the sand and hoping it'll go away.
Not an option. Ignoring online conversations, it's almost guaranteed to make a crisis worse. In fact, technology can be a really powerful tool in crisis management.
Speaking of tech, how are companies leveraging technology to navigate these situations? What's the latest and greatest?
Social media monitoring tools, those are essential now. They provide real-time insights into public sentiment. So you can track how a crisis is unfolding, adjust your response accordingly.
So it's like having your finger on the pulse of public opinion, which is everything in a crisis, right?
It's everything. And sentiment analysis tools can actually analyze social media posts, news articles, to gauge the public's perception.
So you're not just seeing what people are saying, but how they feel about it. That's powerful.
It is. And it's incredibly valuable in informing those communication strategies, mitigating damage. And in addition to monitoring, some companies are using data analytics to model different crisis scenarios, predict potential outcomes, develop more effective response strategies.
It's like crisis management meets the Matrix.
Yeah.
But even with the best technology, the best laid plans, things don't always go according to script. Take the Samsung Galaxy Note 7. Phones catching fire, multiple recalls. It was a mess.
It was. What's interesting about that case is that their initial attempt to fix the problem, just a simple battery replacement, it actually failed.
So their first attempt to put out the fire kind of backfired.
You could say that.
Right.
This could have been the end of the Note 7, but Samsung, they changed a different path.
Okay, so they owned up to the flaw. That's a good start. But how did they win back the public's trust? Because people were, understandably, nervous about their phones bursting into flames.
They didn't hesitate. Samsung issued a second global recall, pulled the Note 7 from the market entirely. They were very transparent about the issues, publicly acknowledged their missteps, and outlined the steps they were taking to make sure it wouldn't happen again.
Okay, so transparency, check. Taking responsibility, check.
Mm.
But they also had to assure people that this wasn't going to happen again.
Right, and they went beyond just a simple recall. They completely overhauled their battery safety testing protocols, implemented more rigorous standards. They showed a real commitment to learning from their mistakes.
That's huge. We messed up, we're fixing it, and we're making sure it never happens again.
It makes you wonder, though, how do companies even begin to prepare for these kinds of situations before they happen? I mean, you can't predict every possible disaster, can you?
You can't predict everything, but you can be prepared. And that's where the idea of a crisis management plan comes in. Okay, so let's talk about that. What exactly is a crisis management plan? It's more complicated than just having a fire extinguisher handy.
Right. A little bit more involved than that. It's essentially a roadmap for navigating those unexpected events, those things that could threaten a company's operations, reputation, bottom line.
A roadmap for when things go haywire. I like it. So give us the highlights. What are the key elements that every good plan should have?
You need a dedicated crisis management team. This team, They're the first responders when a crisis hits. People from PR, legal, operations, senior management, they should all be well-versed in the plan, ready to spring into action.
Got it. So you've got your A-team assembled. What's next?
You got to identify potential crises. What could go wrong? What are the most likely scenarios? And this is where having experts in different areas really helps.
Right, because what keeps a tech CEO up at night might be very different from what keeps, say, a retail CEO up at night.
Exactly. Once you've identified those potential crises, you develop communication strategies for each one. Draft key messages, identify your target audiences, establish clear lines of communication, both internally and externally.
It's like what we were talking about with BP, having those pre-drafted messages, the communication channels ready to go.
It's all about speed and efficiency in those early stages.
Okay, so we've got the team, we've mapped out potential crises, communication strategies are prepped. Anything else?
Clear escalation procedures. Who makes decisions? Who needs to be informed? How does information flow within the company? Because speed is everything in a crisis.
It's like a well-oiled machine, but for disaster management. You're making a very compelling case for why this is so important. But let's be real, even with the best laid plans, things rarely go exactly as expected, do they?
You're absolutely right, and that's why flexibility is so important.
Okay, so how do you build flexibility into a plan?
It's less about predicting every possible twist and turn, and more about fostering a culture of adaptability within the company. Encourage open communication, empower employees to speak up if they see a problem, and be willing to adjust your strategies as things evolve.
Because no two crises are the same.
Exactly. A rigid plan can actually be a liability. The most effective ones, they provide a framework for action, but they also allow for adjustments, improvisation.
It's like having a mental toolkit for dealing with chaos, not just a strict set of rules.
That's a great way to put it. And you know what else can be a really valuable tool? Technology.
Ah, yes. Tech to the rescue. I knew it. Tell me more. Tech to the rescue. It seems like that's the case in almost every field these days. But how does that actually play out in crisis management? What are we talking about here?
Well, think of it this way. In a crisis, information is key, right? And today we have this unprecedented ability to gather and analyze information in real time, all thanks to technology.
Okay, that makes sense. But give me an example. What does that look like in action?
Let's say a company releases a new product, right? And there's some unexpected side effects. Maybe people are having some kind of reaction to it, and they start posting about it on social media.
Uh-oh, that's not good.
No, not ideal. But with the right tools, they can identify this issue early on. Social media monitoring tools, they can track keywords related to the product and analyze the sentiment around those mentions.
So it's not just seeing that people are talking about their product, it's understanding how they're feeling about it.
Exactly. Sentiment analysis can distinguish between positive and negative comments, so the company is getting a real-time gauge of public perception. This allows them to react quickly, address the issue before it becomes a full-blown crisis.
It's like having that heads up that a storm's brewing before it actually makes landfall.
Exactly. And it's not just social media data analytics that can help companies kind of simulate different crisis scenarios, predict potential outcomes, and then test out different responses and see which ones are most effective.
So it's like wargaming for the corporate world. But instead of planning for battles, they're preparing for PR disasters.
That's a great analogy. It's about being proactive rather than reactive, anticipating potential threats, and having strategies in place to deal with them.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the importance of transparency and communication to the role of technology in all of this. But before we wrap things up, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
Crisis management, it's not just about surviving the storm, right? It's about emerging from that storm stronger, more resilient. It's about learning from those mistakes, adapting to change, and constantly evolving.
So turning those inevitable bumps in the road, those crises, into opportunities for growth, for improvement.
Exactly, because the only constant is change. And the companies that thrive are the ones that can navigate that change effectively, even when it comes in the form of a crisis.
So listeners, next time you see a company facing a crisis, don't just watch from the